Welcome back to Cute Widgets and More. In last week's episode, I had Alistair Baxter, a co-worker of mine, with me, and he was telling us about Visual Studio. He's not working for Microsoft, he's working for KDAP, but nevertheless, I have some interrogation to continue on here. Alistair, welcome to the channel.
Thank you.
I have one basic question I need to get an answer to in this episode here. That is, how well does Qt integrate with Visual Studio? Do you need to jump through an enormous amount of hoops for it to work out? Or does it work out pretty well? But before we get there, I have another question I'd like to start out with. And that is, what is the relationship between Visual Studio and Visual Studio, the one with the surname Code?
Well, as I started saying last week, the Visual Studio that we're looking at here is Microsoft's native runtime application. I think it's probably mostly made in C++. Various bits of it are in .NET, and it is only for desktop Windows. Visual Studio Code is developed with various web technologies, which can run either in browsers or using the Electron runtime for desktop systems. But it's different a little bit, and it doesn't have some of the flexibility of the layout and things that I was talked about. And it is very dependent on third-party extensions for everything. Even Microsoft's own C++ and other languages supporting it is via extensions that Microsoft provide, which are on the same sort of level as everybody else's. In addition, there was a third version of Visual Studio for Mac. That was just a rebadged .NET editor, and it didn't do very well, and I believe it's been discontinued.
That seems to be a trend these days, isn't it? That the big companies implement some kind of shell, and then the real meat of the application is done by third-party app developers for the shell. So that's I guess the quality there is sometimes up in the air. But anyway, this is about Visual Studio. We'll talk about Visual Studio Code in one of the upcoming episodes as soon as I found a co-worker who dares to go on camera with me. Alistair, Qt and Visual Studio, is that a marriage made in hell or in heaven?
Well, even out of the box, Qt works reasonably well with Visual Studio. Visual Studio is quite good at understanding any kind of C++ code, even some that's uses macros and things in unusual places, like the like Qt does with the
Q_object.
But there is a specific support for Qt in Visual Studio provided by the Qt company via an official extension. So in Visual Studio, if we look in the extensions window, from the Visual Studio Marketplace, if you search for Qt, you will find the Qt company's official Qt Visual Studio tools, and these have been recently updated to version 3 or 3.01, as we see here, which for the first time has official support for CMake projects in Qt. Visual Studio has been supporting CMake for a while in various forms. I believe it's got a lot better in Visual Studio 2022, and although Visual Studio has its own project format, its own build system, that more and more projects are are using CMake, and so Visual Studio is concentrating more and more on its support for that.
And in the context of Qt, that makes even more sense. I mean, you are developing your software in Windows, and then I need to do some extension or whatever on Linux, and Visual Studio project files isn't exactly working that well with my Qt Creator, if not at all, to be more specific.
So if you open Visual Studio and decide to create a new project, you'll see I've already filtered it for Qt applications. You will see now a wizard which lets you choose whether to use the Visual Studio or CMake build process. And if you do so, it will open up a new Visual Studio project, which uses the open folder style that the Visual Studio has to use for CMake projects. So yeah, rather than opening a solution file as you used to, you just point it at the folder, and it understands the CMake configuration files there, and it makes use of the modern CMake presets system, which is commonly used in Visual Studio Code. I think there's probably been a bit of cross-pollination between Visual Studio proper and Visual Studio Code in this support for all of this sort of thing. But the Qt extension sets that up for you, and gives you a Qt application to work with, which uses CMake.
And you just stopped clicking files just when it started becoming interesting. Underneath your H file, there is another file called .ui. How well does that integrate in Visual Studio?
Well, they have made an attempt to integrate it in Visual Studio. If I double click on this file, it opens this, which is essentially the entire UI of the Qt Creator application, which has been sort of
Qt Designer, mind you,
into a docked window inside Visual Studio. So we can add things in here.
Mm-hmm.
And save them. And from here, it has to build it first. Yep, you can edit and see it running as normal. However, there is a little hyperlink here that says detach, which just opens Qt Designer in its full form. And if I were using this, I would probably just do that. It's it's a bit cramped having it inside a code editor.
Mind you, I'm allergic to detached applications. It seems, at least one of the advantages of having it inside there, I guess, is that you still have the key bindings for navigating around with inside of Visual Studio, while if it becomes a separate top-level window, that's gonna be more as a well, yeah.
Yeah, there is some of that. See, there's 2 file menus there. No, it doesn't use the file menu there. If I edit this in Control S, does it? Yep. So some things go in here and some things go out there. It's
and with
making a round hole, I would say, slightly.
And with the Qt plugin, that was the word I was searching for. I guess stuff like mock files and UIC being called and so on all works through CMake seamlessly without any problems.
Yes, I mean that's essentially now just using CMake support for that rather than Visual Studio. So although it opens as a project, and it works well with a build system, and Visual Studio now has a CMake debugger for finding out what's gone wrong if things go wrong. Actual editing of CMake is still a matter of just manually editing the text files to add your own sources in and things. The previous project layout doesn't really integrate.
So if you add a new file in Visual Studio, it will not add that to the CMake file?
No. Oh, actually, it will. No.
Oh, yeah. That's one of the new features in, is it 6.1 that Qt Creator has made it to now? At least one of the new features in Qt Creator very recently was that it now knows how to do that stuff in CMake too, which seems like it's one of those neglected stepchilds, namely CMake support in at least the IDEs that I have been around. But good to see that it's working there. Okay, any final words and thoughts from your side?
When I was thinking about this video, it made me think of another famous Microsoft related video on the internet, featuring Steve Ballmer, who I'm not quite as tall as, and not quite as sweaty as. But, debugger, 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 debugger. That's what you want when you're using Visual Studio. That's the key.
Okay, let those be the final words. Thank you very much for joining me here. In a few weeks, I will find a coworker, or a few episodes at least. I'll find a coworker to talk to about Visual Studio Code. So stay tuned, and until next time, have a great time.
Thank you.